So good evening, afternoon, morning, whatever time of day it is for you, everybody. I am Paul Ducklin from Sophos Naked Security, back for another week's episode of Naked Security Live. This week's topic, as you can see, very short and simple, lessons beyond ransomware. So this week, nothing brand new, just want to revisit some stories that have come out on nakedsecurity.sophos.com in the last few weeks, just to revise some basic stuff. And the stories that I'm specifically referring to, we're going back actually a few weeks. You will remember we talked about a thing called Hafnium, which was a sort of general term for a bunch of hackers who had access to some zero-day exploits against Microsoft Exchange that could let them break into servers and then do whatever they wanted. Now, the Hafnium guys, specifically, they were interested in stealing files, but what our threat response team noticed later is that it wasn't just the Hafnium gang, it was anyone else who could get their hands on these exploits, which are now circulating freely, was kind of getting in on the act for people who hadn't patched. And you'll know that recently we wrote up a story, it looks like that's a King of Spades, that's a Black King. This ransomware goes as Black King or Black Kingdom, and there's the article to look this up on Naked Security. So combining those stories, there is a well-known exploit against Exchange that was patched several weeks ago, and what we found is that the original gang that Microsoft discovered were using it. They were trying to steal files. Seems to be maybe some kind of industrial espionage going on. They're by no means the only crooks using this. Loads of other people have piled in, including what you might call boutique or artisanal ransomware operators. These Black Kingdom guys, they aren't after $10 million a network. They're after $10,000 per computer. But even if someone's offering you the ransom for $10, if you've got backup and you have to restore it, whether you're paying $10 or not, there's still a lot of work to actually get all your stuff back, your computer working properly. That's a problem whether you're at home or at work, and these days, for many people, those two are so intertwined. So let's have a quick look. We're going to look at what this ransomware does, just to remind you, like I said, lessons beyond ransomware, just so you can get your head around, this is what ransomware does. But while I'm telling you this, imagine the number of other ways, either through malware or through mistake or through system failure, that this sort of stuff could happen to you. And then we'll think about how we can deal with that. So like a lot of ransomware, the Black Kingdom stuff, it doesn't matter how it gets in, the final ransomware that arrives, that's the thing that does the sort of the final coup de grace, you might call it, to your computer, to wipe out all your files so that your computer is no use until you do take some action. You either need to restore all your files from a backup if you have one, which we hope you do, or the crooks are hoping that you're going to pay them $10,000 and they'll give you the unscrambling key. So very quickly what this ransomware does, like a lot of ransomware, it leaves your Windows folders and your applications alone. They know that if you're not in a corporate network, like if you're just on your own, they don't want your computer to stop working entirely. They want you to be able to see the extortion note, the blackmail demand. They want you to be able to get online and use your browser or get the Tor browser so you can buy the bitcoins and send them the money. So they want you to be able to use your computer, but not for anything useful, because all your files will be scrambled. The next thing that this ransomware does, in common with a lot of other ransomwares, is it looks through processes that are running. This one in particular is looking to stop any SQL servers that you may have running. Other ransomware will go looking for other programs. Those are particularly if it's attacking a server. If there are programs like database servers, SQL servers, for example, web servers that are actively running, usually those programs keep their really important files, like your database file, could be your customer database. While those files are in use by the server, they're locked, and that means the ransomware can't directly scramble it. So if they just temporarily kill off your SQL server, then suddenly, while they're attacking, all those files are open strata, so they can scramble your most important files along with your least important ones. So a lot of ransomware does that. This ransomware, obviously, if it's not running as an administrator, if it hasn't got that privilege, that bit will fail. Bad luck for the ransomware crooks, but the rest of it, scrambling files that you can have write access to, the ransomware can do that as long as it's logged in with your privileges. And if it's hijacked your account, or if the malware is running on your computer while you're logged in, it's almost certainly at least going to have your privilege, if not more. Like most ransomware these days, this one chooses a random encryption key. So the key you bought for the other computer that got scrambled last week, the decryption key that you got last time, isn't going to work this time. That's the idea. And like most ransomware these days, it doesn't store that key on the hard disk. It just keeps it in memory. In fact, Some of them scramble that key a second time for later. This one tries to upload it to an account that your computer can upload the file to, but only the crooks can download it. So the idea is, after the scrambling's finished, they're the only people with the unscrambling key. Then, of course, goes and scrambles all your files, as many interesting or important files as it can. Now, different ransomwares use different lists of extensions, but they almost all target the obvious files that are important to you: doc, docx, xls, xlsx, pdf, jpeg, mp3, mp4, all of the stuff that you'd need that would PowerPoint files, all the stuff that we generally have that kind of are important in our data. Some of them just do all of the files, like this one, that aren't in specific folders. Others, they just go after the obvious ones, like the servers and the documents and stuff like that. Enough for you to be in real trouble. The last thing that this one tries to do, and a lot of ransomware will do this as well, is it goes and deletes the Windows event log data once it's done. That means that if you do go in later and you try and find out what went on, unless you have another way of having kept logs while things were going along, it makes it much harder to find out what happened. So they're trying to mess with your ability to do any kind of forensic or recovery examination afterwards. And this ransomware doesn't do it, but many ransomwares do. They also go looking for any backup files, processes, services, connected map network drives, plugged in NAS storage devices or whatever. If they can find any online or accessible backup, they'll typically go and wipe that out either while the ransomware is running or just before they start, so that if you think, haha, I don't have to pay $10,000, I've got backup, oh dear, I don't, the crooks have wiped it out first. So this ransomware doesn't try that, but many or most these days do. And of course, the last thing that's common with ransomware and why it gets all the press that it does is ransomware is the one type of malware that doesn't try and hide. It doesn't try and lie low for 3 weeks after it's infected your computer. It doesn't sit there stealing data or sniffing for passwords in the hope that you won't notice. Once it's gone off, once it's scrambled your files, once it's done its dirty work, then it is absolutely in your face. And this one, like many, it will put files all over your computer telling you how to do the decryption, and it'll pop up a message that tells you this is the Black Kingdom ransomware, this is what had happened, by the way, we stole all your files first so we can also extort you over the content. We don't know whether that's true in this case, but in a lot of modern ransomware attacks, the crooks do steal your files before they scramble them, which gives them a second way to extort you. You're paying to get your files back in place, and you're also paying them hush money so they'll wipe out the files so that they won't leak them to the regulator or the media or your competitors or your customers or whatever. So that extortion demand that comes up, ransomware, once it's triggered, it wants you to know what has happened. And in this case, as I mentioned, it's not like, $10 million for your whole network. It's $10,000 in bitcoins per computer. So if you're just somebody at home, you've got one computer, you've got really important files on there, you've got wedding photos, kids' videos, tax returns, documents you've just been preparing, the PhD thesis you have to hand in 3 days' time, then you could find yourself in a situation where you're kind of wondering if, even though $10,000 is a jolly great deal of money, maybe you kind of have little choice but to do a deal with the devil. So let's very quickly, because this has happened in the light of the Hafnium, the exchange vulnerabilities, let's go through the tips that we can learn from. Let's go through what we can learn from this and tips that can help you live, if you like, life beyond and hopefully without ransomware, all the stuff that goes before it. The first and most important thing that this reminds us, because this was a massive media story about this gang that was going after data, presumably for industrial espionage. It sounds like mainstream stuff. They've got these exchange 0 days. They're breaking into computers. You imagine this is all high-flying stuff. It might affect Fortune 100 companies, but nobody's going to be interested in little old me. Well, this is a fantastic, or maybe fantastic is the wrong word, this is an important reminder that that's not how cybercriminality works. Yes, there are some criminal gangs who target very big companies with very large amounts of money, and that's the way they operate. But there are some of those crooks still go after the little guys, and there are some, if you might call them artisan cyber criminals, who'll just come in here, there and everywhere at all sorts of levels. These guys really don't care. They are not going specifically after networks. If they can get into your network because they're using a bug in your Exchange server, and if they can scramble 100 computers in your network, then they're presumably figuring, you know what, you might not pay for all of them, but you're probably going to pay, you might have to pay for more than 1 or 2 or 3 of these at $10,000 a time. So the crooks are interested in you, not because they particularly got you in their sights, or they hate you, or they're after you, or they don't like what you're doing. I mean, maybe some of those things are true sometimes in some cybercriminal attacks, but generally speaking, the crooks will go after whomever they can find and break into now. And the problem here is there are still, it seems, thousands and thousands of unpatched Exchange servers with these so-called Hafnium bugs. The term you'll hear is proxy logon. That's the name given to this batch of exploits. If you go to that article I showed you at the beginning with a little shell as the icon, which teaches you about web shells, which is one of the tricks used in this particular attack, it'll give you the list of the things that you should have patched. Now, these patches, they came out a week before March's Patch Tuesday. They were special early ones because there was such a clear and present danger. So it's kind of like we're having a little bit of, if you remember, WannaCry all over again, where there was this exploit called Eternal Blue. It had been patched a couple of months before. It escaped from the NSA in the US. And you could have patched, but lots of people hadn't quite got round to it yet, even 2 months later. And we know what happened. That thing went all over the world. It became a huge problem. And yet, at the time of that big attack, it wasn't quite a zero-day exploit anymore. You could have patched, but a lot of people just hadn't quite got there yet. And we're still in that situation. These Black Kingdom ransomware attacks that our own Sophos managed threat response team have looked into. Not a lot of incidents, but sufficiently many that you realise, crikey, even though not that many people are running their own Exchange servers anymore, they tend to be using cloud email, there are still obviously plenty of them, and of those there is at least a significant minority that still haven't patched, despite the clear and present warnings and the clear and present dangers. So the tip number 0 is don't rely on the no one's interested in little old me. It hasn't worked with cyber criminals pretty much forever, because there are always going to be some cyber criminals who will take whatever they can get. And if you think back to last century, into the late 1980s and the 1990s, almost all malware attacks then had nothing to do with their money. They were just about seeing what the crooks could do. It was just they could do it and they did do it. And there are still crooks like that out there today. So some crook is probably interested in you, even if they're not interested specifically in you. If they can find a hole, if they can find a vulnerability you haven't patched, they will surely exploit it. And then you're going to find out just how interested they are. So tip number 1, patch early, patch often. I don't know how many times we've said on the video. I don't get tired of saying it because it is important. And this is a reminder that there are still lots and lots of networks out there running Exchange servers. You think they'd be important, right? They've got your email and like a web interface to let you interact with your stuff. You'd think that you'd patch because that's really important, and that Hafnium story was all over the news. Apparently, there are still some that haven't been patched yet. Don't be that person. Tip number 2, of course, do your backups, even if you're at home. It isn't that hard, and we've mentioned this before on Naked Security Live. There's a there's a simple way of thinking about backups, a little aide-memoire, if you like, which is called 3, 2, 1. And what that's saying is, ideally, if you've got important files, you should have 3 copies of them. One is the file you're working on now, and then you don't just have one backup, because if that's gone, you haven't got anything. So you have 3 copies of the file. One you're working on now, and 2 backup copies. That's the 3. 2 suggests, ideally, what you want is 2 different sorts of technology for your backup. So don't just plug in 2 removable drives at the same time and copy the same file, that one file, in exactly the same way to 2 identical removable drives plugged into your computer at the same time. Because if something goes wrong with that backup system, it will probably affect both of them. So go for 2 different ways of doing your backup. And the one means, for one of those backups, make sure that you keep it offline. In other words, where the crooks, even if they do break into your computer or network, they can't get at it because it's unplugged. It's in the cupboard under the stairs where they can't reach it. Offline, and ideally, if you can, I know it's a little more difficult in lockdown, off-site. Even if that's just an encrypted USB drive that you take to a friend's place, maybe if they've got one you can swap. That way you can't look at each other's files. They're sick if their drive gets stolen from your house or vice versa. If they're encrypted, they're no use to anyone else, even to the person who's storing them. But it does mean that if you can't get into your house, maybe it gets flooded and you can't access it and you need to access your backups, you've got another place to go for them. But the really important part of that is not so much the off-site, but the offline. Tip number 3, it's tricky, I know, to do it at home, but you can try anyway. We've got some advice in that Black Kingdom article on nakedsecurity.sophos.com. Peruse your logs. And remember, the word peruse actually means study carefully. A lot of people think, oh, peruse just means give a glance at it. It doesn't. It means that there's no point in keeping logs if you're not going to look at them. Now, unfortunately, at home, it's not quite as easy as you might think. For example, if you want to get logs out of your home router, every router does it differently. So my recommendation is log into your router and go through all the options that it has to find out what it can tell you about who's trying to hack what when. and then learn what gems might be in there and go and look regularly. Similarly, if you're on Windows, you could learn you can learn interesting things to look for in the Windows event log or in var log direction, somewhere like you've got a Mac or Linux. If you have a blog or some kind of content management system, learn how to look at who's been doing what, because those typically have change logs that show you who's been editing. If you're in the habit of looking at those, you should see all your own changes. If you see ones that aren't supposed to be there, then you know something bad's going on. And in any cloud services you use, many of those have rollback systems, which is a great way of recovering data, like a sort of emergency instant backup, if you like. And they'll also have methods of doing logging. Unfortunately, I can't give you a magic way of looking at all the logs on all of your systems. It does require a little bit of an investment of time, but it's well worth it. Often you'll find after an attack that when you go and look at the logs, actually the signs were kind of there all along. And if you just looked a little bit earlier, you might have been able to head it off the pass. The other thing is, if crooks are in your network and you know where to go and find out what's in your logs, it's very unlikely that the crooks will be able to destroy all of the logs on all of your systems in all of the places that you use. And those logs are the key to knowing what the crooks did. Because the last thing you want if you had crooks in your network is that they've opened a little backdoor hole so they can get in next time, and you don't notice. You clean up everything except that little backdoor hole. You think, phew, I've recovered. And then they just come back in again. And lastly, this is rather specific, but it's quite handy when you are dealing with ransomware or other data damaging malware or problems that you might have. If you're looking for a new antivirus, consider one that has some kind of anti-scrambling or encryption protection system. For example, in the Sophos products like Sophos Home and our business products, we have a thing which we call CryptoGuard. Kind of does what it says. If it sees some process is suddenly starting to scramble your files one by one, it will A, jump in and stop that process, and B, it will kind of instantly revert those files so that the damaged data gets recovered. Of course, you can't guarantee that will always work. If the crooks have been wandering around your network and you've got a protection like that, for all you know, if they've been in long enough and they've got administrator powers, they might have turned that feature off. But it's a good feature to have because it stops you from crooks that are trying to scramble your files regardless of how they try to do it. So it doesn't require recognizing any specific strain of ransomware. It just relies on watching for the behavior that says somebody is trying to do something nasty to all of your files, and that's no good. And so if you can stop that automatically. So very, very quickly, tip number 0, do not rely on the excuse that no one's interested in little old me. These Black Kingdom guys show that somebody probably is interested, and if they can get in, they will. Tip number 2, patch early, patch often. These attacks happened because people didn't patch, even though they've had several weeks when they could have done so, and there's been not a lot of news about it. Don't leave it till tomorrow, and don't just assume that maybe somebody else did it. Or if it's happening automatically, that it definitely happened, go and check. Tip number 2, do your backups, and remember that 3-2-1 rule. You want 3 copies, you want them in 2 different ways, and you want ideally one of them offline and off-site where the crooks can't get at it, even if they do get into your network. Tip number 3 is if you're collecting logs, you've got information that could help you, do go and look at it. If you're going to collect logs and not look at them, you might as well not collect them. You'll save yourself a whole lot of disk space. And lastly, if you're looking at some kind of specific anti-encryption protection technology, anti-scrambling protection technology, then that's something that you could look for in a threat protection or an antivirus program if you're looking for one. So thanks for listening, everybody. It's not a huge deal to fight back against these crooks. It's the little things that matter, and it's just remembering to do them all the time. Sort of like the price of protecting your data is eternal vigilance. So thanks for listening, everybody, and until next week, stay secure.